Welcome to Self-Formation BU. I am Edna Scher, keynote speaker, networker, and educator in health, prevention, and functional medicine. This podcast is my platform to share knowledge freely because education is empowerment and prevention is the most powerful medicine we have. Here, I connect science, epigenetics, gut health, hormones, trauma, and leadership culture, bridging medicine with the real world of doctors, practitioners, and business owners who want to create healthier teams and sustainable success. Because let's be honest, less sickness in your team is the best pill for a growing and thriving business. Self-Formation BU is about seeing a whole picture, connecting your biology, your mindset, and your environment. Whether you are a healthcare professional, an entrepreneur, or someone who simply wants to understand your body better, this podcast gives you practical insight, expert conversations, and strategies you can apply immediately. Knowledge should not be hidden. It should flow. Welcome to this movement of mine. Enjoy the show. Welcome to Self-Formation BU. Today, this morning, in episode 78, approaching the 80, I have Gabriella Rose with me from Sydney, Australia. So we are definitely opposite day and night, or day and evening, right? Welcome
Absolutely.
Finally to the show. And please introduce yourself and tell us who you are and why you are the person that you are today.
Well, that's a big question, Edna, but I'll start with Gabriella Rosa. I'm a fertility specialist. I help couples overcome infertility, recurrent miscarriage, and failed treatments. And since 2001, actually, I've been practicing, and our program has a 78.8% live birth rate, which was my Harvard study when I was doing my master's in public health at Harvard, and since have completed my doctor of public health there as well. So I guess the question to what makes me who I am today is a big one. It goes back, probably before my birth, really. But I think that lots of influences have shaped me, and I think certainly my patients have been a big influence in my life, and the challenges that they overcome have really been quite inspiring to me over many decades now. It's 2.5 decades. It's like, wow, okay, time is flying. I started seeing babies of my patients graduating from university and going to the army and, doing all of these amazing things in the world. And I'm thinking, oh my God, how did the time fly? It's quite incredible.
That's cool. So, from public health, how did you change your career to fertility? What was
It was the other way around, actually. It was fertility first. And I trained originally as a naturopathic practitioner in Sydney, Australia. And, I've been practicing as a naturopath for all of these years. And in about 2007, I decided to kind of start really diving in fully into fertility. 2001 to 2007, I was doing general and fertility. I was trained by Francesca Naish in Sydney. You may know that name. And she was one of, she was one of the kind of foremost figures in fertility for many, many years. She probably has been practicing now, gosh, she's been practicing for about 55 years, Okay, she was practicing for 30 years before I started, and she was one of my great mentors. And so, so that was a big influence in my life, and certainly it was a big influence in the work that I do today. And then, of course, when I decided to start practicing on my own, I really had already developed a passion for fertility and fertility treatment. In 2013, I decided to take that into solely Tele-Health. So in 2003, we started doing kind of, over the phone consultations. And that was something that was just part of, people would get referred. They weren't in Sydney. So it was just easy to get the phone and talk to them and treat them in that way. And it was really fascinating fascinating because I remember early on in my career having had patients who had had babies from, me treating them who I didn't even know what they looked like. So it was like, oh, finally finding out what they looked like was quite a surprise. And in 2013, I had my first child in the year before. And I decided, okay, I can't be doing 60 patient hours a week anymore. It's just not going to be a feasible and viable way of continuing to support and help the people that I really want to. And so I transitioned from physical clinic to the patients that I was treating at the time. They were mostly in other countries, so they weren't actually even coming into the clinic, for the fertility treatment part that I was focusing on. And so I basically made the decision, in my sleep deprived haze, that I was going to shut down the physical arm of the practice and do only telehealth. And I started to make that work very, very well. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and it was for us just another day in the office,
Yeah.
So clinics were shutting down left, right, and center. And, IVF places were like trying to figure out what do we do from here. And for us, it was just really very, very easy. So now, we're in a position where we treat patients in 6 continents, in around the world. And we've educated and treated over 217,000 people in more than 111 countries. So it's been a journey, and of course the drive to public health really became about really figuring out, how do I make a difference from that local community of the people who can actually access and have access to me and to my clinic and to my clinicians, to something much greater. How do we influence populations? How do we influence the care that people receive? Because when it comes to fertility, unfortunately, for a lot of people, they don't have the access. It's not even, people want to do the best that they can, but many things work too slowly, in terms of fertility and in terms of getting the answers that one needs and in terms of getting the treatment that one needs and access to treatment. There are barriers, and there's access, information barriers and treatment barriers. And so I wanted to remove many of those barriers and help people to be able to figure out, okay, how do we implement the things that we can in the best possible way and optimize everything that a person can do and a couple can do? And, then we utilize the standard healthcare system as more of a foundational kind of understanding from a diagnostic perspective, what needs to be done. But that foundational aspect of self-care already being in place. So that was something that was really, I was very passionate about from the very beginning, and the kind of work that I've been doing for very, very many years now. So it was
I do have a few
clinician
questions
first,
already.
public health later.
Okay, interesting. I mean, public health has a lot to do with fertility, because fertility has to do with everything. And it's also a mindset. And if you heard like words of a parent, you will never have children, it might be the case until you remove this kind of mindset
Thinking.
out of your head. But it can be endometriosis, PCOS, low sperm count, whatever. Um, that can be affected too. I've got one question to you. Do you have your own kids?
I have 2.
And how
Yeah.
old are they?
So they are now 14 this year and 11. And I was told, by a gynecologist when I was 18 that I would never have children. And so that was a very interesting, oh, okay. And to me at the time, being 18 and being told that, I mean, the biggest concern, I guess, that I had was that all of a sudden my period stopped, and I wasn't sure as to why. And I wanted to find out and get answers as to why that was the case. And so I went, and I used to work for obstetrician gynecologists whilst I was studying. I worked in a practice with multiple gynecologists and obstetricians. And so I asked one of the female gynecologists, I said, my periods have like not showed up for 6 months. I'm not pregnant. Is there something that you would recommend I look into, And she goes, well, you probably have to just do some blood tests. And I was like, oh, okay. So which blood tests? And in the end, I decided to go and see somebody else just to kind of like keep things separate, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I did. And as I went to the consultation, of course, I was, kind of faced with what I think many patients, unfortunately, still get faced with these days, which is not being heard. I told the doctor, I said, hey, listen, I have had multiple pregnancy tests. I'm not pregnant. My periods have stopped. I didn't even finish saying what I was saying. And he turns around and says, every woman is pregnant until proven otherwise. And I'm like, okay. So, so he
Interesting.
goes here. Exactly. It was very interesting.
You
And
didn't get
so
the
he goes,
diagnosis of PCO? Because that's something that is being
well,
thrown out of the window quite easily.
well, this is what ended up happening. He basically said, look, go do these tests. And, once the results come back in a couple of days, just give me a call and I'll let you know over the phone. So I was like, okay, cool. So I went and had the blood tests, results come back, and he goes, you have polycystic ovarian disease. And I'm thinking,
Oh, wow.
A disease. Like, literally, all I could think and hear is like disease. And I'm like, oh, okay. Am I going to die? Like, literally, I was concerned. I was like, so is this really serious? I was 18, had no idea, had never heard of PCOS or PCOD.
I never
as
heard of
he decided.
PCOD before.
Yeah, and
Rotterdam
that was the
folks.
previous name.
Uh-huh.
That was the previous name of PCOS. And so anyway, he basically said that and then I said, okay, so is it really serious? Am I going to die? Like, what's the deal? And he goes, no, you're probably just never going to have children. I'm like, oh, so much better. I was like, what? How do you deliver that kind of news to an 18-year-old over the phone?
Yeah,
Anyway,
go.
Since I have experienced many other interesting situations,
Yes.
certainly with my patients, so I don't even question it anymore. But it's really quite interesting, the bedside manner of certain clinicians, and you go like,
I know.
wow.
But unfortunately, it's not only in fertility that they don't know how to communicate, it's also in cancer.
Many. I think
This
it's
is
across.
like
I think
something that is very,
clinicians, the empathy really
is
gets,
lacking.
lost.
Mm.
Yeah. And I think, to a certain extent, it's really, I have to be honest, like it's such, I see thousands of patients every year. And you do, as a clinician, you really need to police yourself because it's so common for you to see what you see. And, every single time that I get in front of a consultation with a patient, I remind myself of one very important thing, which is this is the first time this person is going to be hearing this. And I think that as a clinician, we really have to be cognizant of what we say and how we say it, because you may talk about this. I talk about this 12 hours a day. And so every single day. And so for me, it's clear, it's obvious, it's just another conversation that I'm having with another person. Hence why before I get into every single one of my consultations, I check myself and I go, okay, this person has only read or heard this conversation this time. So how is this going to impact them? How are they going to take this away with them? How am I going to empower them to use this information for the best possible decision making on their end? And it's a conscious decision. It's a conscious, mindful choice of mine every single time. And so it is, I understand that sometimes you get clinicians who are not that conscious about the fact that that person is hearing it for the first time. And I think there's also an aspect of personality to that as well. And this is where I think, you do have to at least be able to feel not understood necessarily, but at least feel like your clinician has your best interest at heart for that relationship to go well. Because people will have different personalities, and I'm not for everybody either, like I'm very direct. And so what happens is that, I will say things compassionately and with empathy, but very directly. And so people have to either decide whether they like that or not. And not everybody likes that. And that's okay. I'm not going to change for somebody else in that regard, because I just find that, the way that
You
I
need
am
to be
here is the way that
authentic.
I'm going to be everywhere. And,
Okay.
you know, I'm not going to adjust myself for that. But if somebody is on the receiving end of that and they feel like, you know what, that doesn't gel with me, it's so important that they find a clinician that does gel with them, you
Mm-hmm.
know, because otherwise you don't feel safe in expressing your concerns, your challenges. And that's how you get the help you need. At the end of the day, you are not going to get the help you need by just being quiet and bottling down whatever it is that you want to
Absolutely.
express. So I think that's such an important part of, and to a great degree, and I think that I sit at this really interesting intersection where, you know, I'm talking to an individual on a clinical level, and I'm also looking at things from a very population based, you know, kind of overview.
Mm-hmm.
Public health is all about, you know, study of populations. It's about
Mm-hmm.
epidemiology. It's about looking at how does this affect the great vast number of people in a community, in a
Mm-hmm.
population. And so, you know, it's always that kind of micro and macro
Macro. Yeah.
situation
Love
that
that.
needs to be looked
Mm-hmm.
at, you know, from those perspectives. And I think that that serves my patients well, because from they start to understand why they were told certain things in the way that they were told. Like I had a conversation today that was really interesting with a woman who basically says, you know, this clinic has told me all of these really negative things, and you are telling me something a bit different. And what was really fascinating is that I actually wasn't telling her anything that the clinic didn't tell her. It's just that I took her values and preferences into consideration, and I explained to her her prognosis based on the fact that she has a choice to make, as opposed
Mm-hmm.
to be told, oh, this is not going to work. You know, you're not going to have a baby with your own eggs, and, you know, you should just give up. She felt
Mm-hmm.
very deflated by that conversation, as opposed to me saying, look, this is an uphill battle. I'm not going to sugarcoat that, because that is how it is. And you have multiple decision points that you can exercise your choice. And that will be based on your values and preferences. That will be based on whether you would consider things like donor egg or donor embryo, or, you know, whether you and your partner want to have a baby more than, you know, a way to have a baby. And so, you know, I think those conversations
Mm-hmm.
are really
They're really
important,
valuable.
because
Mm-hmm.
it leaves people with, you know, a choice to make, as opposed to feeling like they, you know, it was something that was thrust upon them, or that they were victimized by the situation. And I
Mm-hmm.
never want my patients to feel like that. You know, it's
Yeah.
always a decision. So, you know, that's essentially, I think, how I view the situation in a different way to most people. But, you know, in having my own children, I realized that the conception piece, you know,
Mm-hmm.
the attempt to have a baby is only really just the beginning. You know, sometimes we
Absolutely.
get hyper focused on that idea of like, okay, this is not working and I need to make this work. And we forget that from here there's a whole other life, you know, that happens afterwards. And you know, all of that also takes a lot of consideration.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's an interesting journey, that's for sure.
And you've got now teenagers, so I've got small kids still.
Oh, I tell you what, they
Mine is
are, you know,
entering. She's 9 and she's entering. Oh.
yeah. So it's yeah, 14 is. I remember being
Yeah,
14, and I
I
wasn't
also.
the easiest 14-year-old, you know.
So
Like,
you get it mellow back.
so now I'm like, oh my God, what I did to my mom.
Yeah.
I was quite obedient, but I was like, you know, I was just rebellious
But it was
underneath,
also
you
different
know.
times. We were growing up without any mobile phones and iPads
Oh,
and all that stuff.
yes. Oh, very different times indeed. You know, it's, I think that there are so many considerations these days. And part of those considerations, it's the noise that we get, you know, and a
Absolutely.
lot for fertility patients. I think that there is so much of that. All I see, I do a lot of patient education. I use Instagram as
Hmm.
my platform for
Okay.
public health education, essentially. You know, so if people are interested, they can go to Gabriella as a fertility. It's Gabriella with 1L. But what's interesting, and what I see there, is how much misinformation you have to combat in the way, that you actually talk about things, because people, sometimes obviously I get retargeted for every possible thing, fertility under the sun, and a lot of it, I look at it and I go, I beg your pardon. Like, are they really talking about this? And, is this something that benefits people? Because you see, the problem is not so much about the harmless, things that people are told to do. The problem is that sometimes people are told to do those things and they think that the action of being busy doing them is the only thing they need to do. You see?
Tell them usually
And so
to go for vacation. Just go to vacation.
well,
Don't take your social media with you. You have heard me talk about gut, right? Let's talk about gut and diversity. You heard me talk about that as well. Your gut is your foundation for everything, both for your brain functionality, both for hormonal functionality, your immune system, just for everything, and even your cravings. Why do you have cravings for one thing but not for the other? That is a question of diversity. And so Zinzino has got Xenobiotic. That's a powder prebiotic fiber with 8 different fibers that are all for your gut, for your microbiota in your gut. We have also a gut health test, and there you can gain valuable insight into your individual microbiome profile and the functionality of it. Modern prevention doesn't rely on guesswork. It relies on data. As a practitioner, I can recommend to you to do a gut health test, a microbiome test, a balance test, a vitamin D test, because that gives you the clues for your health. What you should eat, your lifestyle, into a clear strategy. If you want to know more, please don't hesitate and contact me.
The thing about it is that, they then end up utilizing a lot of that time and fertility potential, adding things to a to-do list that doesn't actually drive outcomes. It doesn't drive the result that they're trying to create. And so, it could be harmless, but when it starts to rob that agency and that opportunity to actually do things that actually work, that becomes harmful, and a lot of times I see this happen, with people getting information from online and trying to navigate a process on their own, because what ends up happening is that they don't know how to discern, like, what is correct, what is not correct, what is extrapolation of evidence versus what's actually being communicated in a way that's balanced. There's a lot of those questions that fertility patients become almost a target to.
Fertility patients are quite obsessed about the fertility. That's one
Doing
of the
things.
things. Yeah, doing things to get to the results. So yeah, when I counsel with the clients who are fertility patients, I also ask them, okay, now you're pregnant and then you're having a baby, and then think about the aftermath. It's not just the falling pregnant. You need to keep the pregnancy. You want to have probably a healthy natural birth, because that's also, I mean, in Europe, to at least if you are IVF, you have to have a C-section, which I find
wow,
counter.
That and that's
creating the next problem.
Yeah,
Completely crazy.
Interesting.
I had two IVF children, and I gave both normal, natural birth.
Yeah. I mean, I see, unless there are specific reasons and complications for a pregnancy, I don't think that there is a reason to just go, because you've had IVF, you should go and have a C-section.
It's an industry. It's an industry.
Yeah. And fertility is part of all of that as well, because what ends up happening is that the misaligned interests of the different people and, let's say, institutions or organizations in the process. The patient almost becomes a secondary conversation in the face of profit. Many clinics now, I think that I was reading some statistics to say that in the UK 60% of IVF clinics are private equity owned, and the US is becoming, it's close to 50 to 60% as well, which essentially means this: as a private equity enterprise, you want profit. That is shareholders, you want profit for your shareholders. And so what that means is that for the patient, it becomes a numbers game. When you hear it's a numbers game from an IVF cycle, you do have to question, what are the numbers we're talking about? Are we talking about number of cycles that increase profit, or are we talking about how quickly I can get my healthy baby? And usually it's the first, it's not the second. It's the profit driven factor that will be playing a role. Because if you look at how this actually plays out in a universal healthcare system, you have very strict eligibility criteria to access IVF if you're going to do it as part of the healthcare system in a public setting. What happens is you have to meet very strict eligibility criteria, because what is the purpose of public health? To deliver the absolute most to the least, the most number of people, because there are limited resources, right? So you want to do the best that you can for as many people as possible at the lowest possible cost. And so what ends up happening is that eligibility for IVF is going to be determined by the people who have the absolute best possible likelihood of taking home a healthy baby. And you get 1 or 2 cycles depending on the country, and if you're lucky, and if you don't have another child, if there's a whole lot of considerations and hoops that you have to jump over. Once you move from that structure to a privatized system, you start hearing, oh, just keep trying. It's a numbers game, just keep going. And so you then have to figure out, okay, well, what is it that we're actually trying to do here? Is it really a numbers game? Or is it something that, I need to prepare for? I need to really be ready. Obviously the better somebody's health prior to a conception attempt, whether it's natural or through IVF, the better it's going to be, right? And so we want to make sure that, certainly for my patients, I'm looking at 2 very important things. One, where are the gaps and places of opportunity? What is it that we're looking at? The second thing is, what is it that we can do to optimize health? Because we know that a healthy body is a fertile body, and vice versa. And also that fertility is a team sport. We're not going to get the same possible outcome by addressing only one part of that equation. The best results come from really looking at both partners and really addressing male factor with the same vigor and rigor, that we would the female side of the equation. So I think that those are very important concepts for patients to understand, because through standard care, you literally just get told, here you go, you're going to go and, take these drugs, you're going to go and do ultrasounds on these days, we're going to collect the eggs, you come in on this day to deposit your sperm, as if the man was some kind of sperm donor, and then basically it's like, okay, we're done with you now. And then when a cycle doesn't work, or a second cycle, or a third cycle, or a 10th cycle, they're still being told. I had a patient today who 12 cycles later is going like, I know that there are problems here, and I'm just being told to do another cycle. I'm like, I'm so glad you're here.
Now I'd like to actually interrupt you and ask you, what is your approach? I mean, because you do only telehealth or Zoom health or whatever, how do you treat your clients worldwide?
So we have an approach. Yeah, absolutely. So we've developed an approach where we have a framework that is called the Fertile Method. And what it does is it really identifies all of the different areas and places where we can make improvements. The first place we start with is with understanding what is it that is getting in the way? What are the obstacles? And so diagnostic testing is a really important part of beginning treatment because, in my opinion, when was the last time you fixed a problem you didn't know you have?
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like I always tell the story of the time that I had a leaking toilet, and it was really interesting because I brought this plumber in. They said, oh, no problems. We'll have to reseal the bowl. We'll have to remove it, seal it. 24 hours later, you can use it again. And I'm like, okay. So 5 visits later, we still have a leaking toilet. 2 plumbers later, I'm being told, oh, it's probably the wall that's leaking and we're probably going to have to remove some tiles. We'll have to bring this $3,000 machine. I'm like, stop right now. Stop right now because I am not removing tiles from the wall. I don't have tiles to replace it. So that's not going to happen. And so I was going on holidays and I said, look, let's just pause all of this. Let me go on holidays, leave the toilet off. And when I come back, I'll decide what to do. So I literally, as I looked at the kind of mess and the water that was everywhere, I'm like thinking, okay, there's something here that obviously they haven't found what the problem is. Let's see if the wall is leaking. And, when I come back from holidays, I'll deal with it. And so I came back from holidays, everything was completely dry. And I'm thinking, oh, maybe it fixed itself. This is very good news. Excellent. So I go in the shower and as I turn around, I look at the floor and the floor is bubbling up with water. And I realized there and then that I don't have a toilet leaking problem. I have a shower waterproofing problem. And it wasn't going to cost me a $3,000 machine and a few tiles off the wall. It was going to cost me a $30,000 bathroom renovation. But the point is that at least I found out what the problem was because it was never going to be fixed by just continuing to reseal this toilet. And eventually I was going to end up with, seeking water into the first floor of my house because they hadn't found the problem. It would have been a much bigger exercise had I not, gone, no, hang on a second, we have to take a step back here, And so I see fertility in that very same way. And that became a really good analogy for what fertility patients go through, because it's the cycle after cycle process that without asking deeper questions and understanding, okay, why did this last cycle fail? What is it what were the obstacles that made it not go as planned? And I find that very seldom those questions get asked. And certainly even more seldom do they get answered. So that really is my approach, is actually understanding, okay, what are we actually dealing with first before we understand that? Because you see, let's say, for example, sometimes we have high DNA fragmentation in sperm, okay? 2 examples that are completely opposite. One, it could be because of a varicocele. It could be a varicose vein on the testicle that's increasing heat and it's creating the high DNA fragmentation in the testicle, in the sperm. Another possibility is that we have a silent infection that hasn't been identified, and that requires antibiotics, not surgery, to address. So if we're going to treat every case of high DNA fragmentation in the same way, we're going to miss a great percentage of cases that are not going to be helped by taking antibiotics, or vice versa, varicocele surgery, because not everybody needs either of those things, right? Sometimes I've had patients who need both of those things. But the reality of it is that first you have to identify what is the priority and how do we rank those things in priority? And then we go about treating it rather than just saying, okay, now everybody who has infertility needs to go and do IVF. Some people do need to do IVF. Absolutely. It's the best possible, outcome for them. But many people do not. They're just sent down that path because not enough testing, not enough understanding, not enough treatment that supports them actually being able to conceive naturally has happened, and it becomes a default process in the healthcare system for various reasons. But yeah.
So I have another question for those who are listening now or later. So let's say you're talking to someone in the UK, but you're in Australia. Do you refer them to a clinic to do the tests? And the second question is, do only allopathic testing, or do you also check for vitamin deficiency, fatty acids, microbiome analysis, things like that?
Yeah. So there's a couple of, so that's, those are great questions. So the first thing that we do in terms of like when we have to get testing done, and often that's where we begin, and every patient will have some level of testing. And so what happens is that we will write letters, or we'll first analyze the case, see what's missing, see what we need to do. We then will write a letter of referral so that they can first and foremost go to their PCP, their primary doctor, to basically get tests done that they will do. And in many cases, with a prior history of infertility, miscarriage, and failed treatments, you will get a bulk of testing done by your primary care doctor before you having to escalate that to anybody else. Then we figure out, sometimes it's a lot of back and forth that sometimes needs to happen, because not every doctor will agree to do all of the tests, and sometimes some will agree to do some of the tests, and then you have to escalate that to other doctors. We usually get it done fairly quickly, but it's a combination of primary care specialists and sometimes private testing. And so usually we are looking at, I always go by the evidence and the science. Like, I'm looking at, okay, what are the best tests to give me the understanding that I need about the most direct path to baby. So your question to, in terms of like, do we do functional testing? Yes and no. It's not the first resort. We will always do, let's say standard tests first that are validated, that have a lot of background science to validate them. Because you see, a lot of tests that, and, we don't need to go into details of which and what to do and what not to do.
It's very individual.
Because that's going to, that's going to be personalized. Exactly. That's going to be very personalized to the individual and to the couple. But, what a lot of functional testing that gets touted out there as, oh, you have to do this test. Well, actually, I find that most people don't need to do that test. And what they need first is to find out the broad spectrum of how all their systems are working first. And in that, it includes nutritional deficiencies. Your standard medical tests will actually include many nutritional deficiencies if you request for them individually. And the validation of functional testing is problematic to me in many cases, because you can do independent validation, and if it's not third-party tested and retested, which is what happens with a lot of different, kind of medical testing that becomes mainstream, you don't have enough samples to be able to see if those results are actually as accurate as they can be. Because you've got to think about something in terms of testing as well. And this is why I don't ever go by reference ranges, lab reference ranges, when it comes to results. Because the second that you go for lab reference ranges, you are dealing with the population of people who have gone and done that test. Now, if you think about the people who are most likely to go and do blood tests, they are the sicker portion of the population. Typically, they are not the people who are the healthiest. Of course, you get the outliers. You get the people like you and I who want prevention, who want to be as healthy as possible, who will do tests when they, most medical doctors would say you don't need those tests. It's like, okay, but I want to have them. I want to have them. So just charge me if you need to, but I will have them. And so most of the time, it's people who are not well who are going to have blood tests. And so what ends up happening, and thyroid is a great example of this, because you have such a vast, huge range of dysfunction that gets labeled as normal, that it blows my mind.
As from 1.5.
Well, zero, literally from 0 to 5,
exactly.
Normal.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, we know from medical guidelines that anything above a 2.3, 2.5 in a TSH result is going to increase the risk of miscarriage. So, you go, okay, normal. It might be normal for a person who hasn't had 5 miscarriages, but it certainly is no longer normal for somebody who has a history of inability to conceive, inability to keep a healthy pregnancy to term, child treatments. And so that's where the person who is struggling to take home a healthy baby gets treated like the average person in the general population who has a drunken one-night stand and gets pregnant, you see. And that makes no sense, because they are completely different people with completely different needs and requirements. And, you know, no judgment to how people get pregnant, whatever floats your boat, go do the thing. But the reality of it is that when we're talking about the subpopulation of people who struggle with infertility, which is, mind you, by 2 years of trying, 96.3% of the population has conceived, right? And are on path to taking home their healthy baby.
I also have a record like that with my clients. Everyone conceived. I had so many patients who did IVF, didn't function, post-cancer, whatever. I said to them, look, just do that and you will see. And 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 months later, I get a WhatsApp, I'm pregnant. Like, yay, without any.
And look, the reality is that some people will conceive without any treatment at all, even, after a long-standing time.
I also love science and like to see the tests.
Yeah. So, and the thing about it is, I think that that's one of the most important things. It's the fact that it fast tracks results. Ultimately, that's what I'm looking for my patients, because by the time they come to me, on average, so we did the Fertility Breakthrough Program was a study that I did for my master's in public health at Harvard. So what we did was we analysed the patients who were coming through and the results that we were getting. And there was 544 patients in this analysis. We had an average of 4 years of infertility, plus or minus 2.5. So the people who were coming to me, they weren't trying for 2 minutes. They were trying for a very long time. The majority of patients, 51.5%, had experienced recurrent miscarriage. That rate dropped to 13.5% after treatment. And 45, almost 46% of the people who came to me had previously failed IVF cycles. And 60% of the patients who conceived ended up conceiving naturally. Only 5.6% actually needed donor egg, when most of them were told they needed donor egg. So the reality of it is that when people come to me, they've done many, many, many things that haven't worked. And usually they are leaning towards the end of their fertile window, and the fertility opportunity that they have to even have a baby ever. And so for me, it's very important that we are very precise and very specific on the things that we need to do, because we have no time to waste. We have no cycles to waste. Yeah. We really need to be getting things done quickly. And we also see that results aren't fast. We start seeing biochemical change at about 6 months. Some people, it takes a year. And it's a year that they've actually put in place to really, completely transform their results. For somebody who has been trying for 5 years and it takes them a year to get pregnant, well, it's a bonus, right? But the reality of it is that we want to do that even faster. And so, ultimately, that precision helps us achieve quicker outcomes.
I've got another question for you. So you work internationally. Are you also connected with doctors, specialists, and so on locally for your clients?
We are, and sometimes people already have a team that they're working with. And so we don't, again, I think, what I've said earlier in terms of like you needing to be comfortable with the doctor that's treating you, I think is extremely important. So we don't actively try to get people to switch medical team unless it's not working for them. Yeah. Right? Unless we're not getting done what we need to get done, and unless their doctor is an absolute difficult person. And in those cases, yes, we may make recommendations and suggestions. Okay. And you, as you said, you were trained in the beginning as a naturopathic doctor, so you use also your tools in that line and probably also in coaching. Absolutely. We use herbal medicines as part of, the foundational aspect of treatment. We use nutritional supplementation, very personalized and customized. We use pharmaceutical grade everything in terms of, the medicines that we utilize. And the majority of our prescription-based nutrients are actually prescribed and sent from Australia, because the TGA regulation is much more strict than many places around the world. And so we know what we can expect with the quality of the different things that we utilize. And it's one of the reasons as well why you will never hear me. I mean, I've been doing this work now for 25 years. You will absolutely never hear me talking about this supplement you should buy online to treat your fertility.
Yeah.
Like, you will never hear me creating my own supplement range and making that be the, be all and end all. Not because I couldn't do that, because that was actually my job when I first started practicing. I actually worked for a supplement company formulating supplementation that was for practitioner only supplements. But it's because, you see, the science changes so quickly, and forms of nutrients changes, the things that you actually need to input in products in order for you to be able to actually have really good results changes constantly. And so what happens when you make a batch of supplements, that if you are practicing and you don't have the volume, it might take you 2 years to get through that in terms of selling it. You will be selling things to patients who actually need something completely different because you have stuff sitting on the shelf that you need to get rid of, right? That's why that's never been a model for me. I want effectiveness. I want ensuring that my patients are getting the very best and the latest scientific evidence. So supplementation for me needs to be prescribed based on proper testing, based on understanding what it is that the history requires, based on understanding what the current situation requires. And only then we're really, and for me, it's also about minimum viable, outcome, minimum viable dose, effective dose, and really looking at how do we get the best possible result, the most direct path to baby. So, my whole master's in public health at Harvard was about clinical effectiveness, and so really I'm constantly measuring how we're doing things so that we can find efficiencies to create effectiveness. That's really the outcome for my patients that I want to see.
Do you know the brand Zinzino by any chance?
I have no idea. No.
No. Oh, wow. I work with them since 4 years now. It's a test-based nutrition, the best omega-3, the best omega-3 in the world. And they started this business because of infertility. She had 14 miscarriages. And the founder of the company, and with the testing, they're from Norway. They tested themselves. Their fatty acids were really bad, and so on. And they have now 3 children naturally.
That's lovely.
Yeah,
that's wonderful.
Okay, so that's a very interesting model that you have. So may I ask about your team? How many people work for you or with you?
We have, actually, good question. I have 6 clinicians, and we currently, in terms of my wider team, we have about 20 staff. So we're, from a clinical perspective, 26. There you go. So I have to look sometimes, So, and 6 of us are clinicians.
Okay. And so everyone works online.
Everyone works online. Yeah. Well, we in the dispensary, we have a head office. And so basically there are people who come into the dispensary to, part of the team are people who actually send things out to patients and manages the head office.
But the team that works with the clients, they're all online.
Yeah.
And so you've got
and we do, like, for example, the last 4 years I've been living in Boston, right? So I've been traveling between here and Boston, which is wonderful because patients don't, we just schedule an appointment. They don't even feel if there is a change, if the practitioner is away, if whatever, because it's just a matter of like logging into a consultation. One of my clinicians loves to live between the UK and Australia. And so, that keeps happening often as well. So it just depends, but most of the clinicians are in Sydney, actually in Australia, not Sydney, but in Australia.
Okay. And so you've got clinicians, and then you've got also coaches and...
No, we have an internal team that, We don't have coaches. So our clinicians are the ones who guide clinically all the patients going through the treatment. But we have different modalities of practitioners that also provide services for our patients. Obviously, our program encompasses and incorporates emotional support, relationship support. There's lots of different aspects of fertility. Fertility really is a holistic conversation, right?
Yeah.
So people will often need different things in order to achieve their outcome. We have a building biologist that works as part of our team. So, there's different components of what it is that our patients experience based on what it is that at the stage that they're in. We have a lactation consultant, mothercraft nurse, because we have a pregnancy and postnatal program. So typically we hold our patients' hands, from beginning to baby and beyond. And so that's essentially, and then of course we have a wonderful internal communications team, and they support a lot of the kind of getting the message out there. So it's been a long journey to get to here. So
it's very interesting.
It's interesting to reflect on all of those pieces.
And now again, for the listeners who are maybe in need of your services, how is it being built? Is it like by packaging? Is it being reimbursable?
We have a program. No, so our service is out of pocket, and we have a program. We have different programs. So depending on what it is that people need, they basically have an assessment first. And through that assessment, we identify what it is that we can provide that supports them or not. If as part of the assessment, we identify that we can't help them, that's pretty much going to come out in that first appointment, right? And there's a very comprehensive clinical review that I will go through and I will do to make sure that we understand where are the gaps, where are the places of opportunity, what it is that we can actually do versus, where there are constraints. I like to say that if there are deal breakers from the outset, we must know that, before we begin. Yeah. And so that's why I assess the cases to make sure that, because also this is the other thing. For me, in the long term, what we're really focused in doing and demonstrating is clinical effectiveness so that we can actually really support patients at a much earlier stage of their fertility journey. At the moment, you go to your primary doctor and you say you have been infertile or have been trying to conceive for 12 months. You will be labelled as infertile. You'll be given a referral to talk to an IVF doctor. In my vision of public health, I like to see that, somebody will go to see a primary doctor and be told, all right, you need to go and do these things. Here is a resource that's going to enable you to do that. And if then at that point, we're still having the conversation of a conception hasn't happened, then we will go and take the next step in terms of, IVF. So I feel for me, really being able to demonstrate that, okay, there is a subset of people who struggle, who need differentiated treatment so that we can make a case for the healthcare system is really the focus. So I assess cases to be able to go, okay, is this the right fit of person so that we aggregate data so that ultimately we can say these people that go through these kinds of experiences need a better way of navigating fertility challenges, So that's my work for the next 50 years. I've got it cut out for me.
50 years. Okay, cool. You're never going to retire, in other words.
Oh, no, I definitely do not intend on retiring. That's good. No, not for me. Not for me. It's funny. It's really interesting, actually, because I find it so inspiring, having gone through Harvard and, having met some of the incredible scientists that continue to work. Like there's some incredible women and men who in their 90s are actively participating in academic circles and policy and, all of these, really population changing things and conversations. And I'm like, yep, that would definitely be me. The way that I intend to die is there is only one of two ways. It's ideally going to sleep and never waking up.
Yeah,
that's the
that
one
would be the
thing.
nicest.
That would be the nicest. But if that doesn't happen, then it has to be something really dramatic, like me giving some kind of delivery
Speech.
and just falling dead on the stage,
Yeah.
that would be my second best way to die as far as I'm concerned. So I'm going for that.
I'll pray for that.
Amen.
And now I know that I could change my world if I change my life. I could resort to start again and live my life.